The cruelest betrayals never begin with enemies. They begin with the people who promise they will never let you fall. Evelyn Harper stood beneath the towering marble arches of the royal court, her hands folded calmly before her as hundreds of silent eyes watched the woman who had once believed love could protect her from ambition. Just days earlier, she had imagined herself becoming queen beside the man she had trusted with every dream. Instead, the throne demanded another choice, and she was the sacrifice no one wished to acknowledge. The prince avoided her gaze, his polished smile unchanged, while noble families whispered that difficult decisions were necessary for the future of the kingdom. No one spoke her name with kindness anymore. They spoke only of destiny, duty, and power. Evelyn felt strangely peaceful as sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the polished floor with brilliant colors that seemed almost too beautiful for such a heartbreaking moment. She searched every familiar face, hoping to find even one expression of regret, but the room remained cold despite the warm morning light. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of fear, she felt clarity. She finally understood that the throne she had protected with loyalty had never intended to protect her in return. The realization hurt less than the silence surrounding it. She closed her eyes and whispered a single sentence that no one else could hear. "If I am given another life, I will never choose this crown again." The world dissolved into brilliant white light, not with pain but with overwhelming stillness, as though time itself had paused to listen. A cool breeze brushed across her face. The scent of fresh roses replaced the heavy perfume of the palace. Birdsong echoed through open windows. Evelyn slowly opened her eyes and found herself standing inside her childhood bedroom, 3 years before the royal engagement that had changed everything. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely breathe. The embroidered calendar hanging beside the window confirmed what seemed impossible. She had returned to the past. Every detail matched the memory she carried. The same wooden dresser. The same faded curtains moving gently in the breeze. The same silver hairbrush resting where she had left it years ago. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, touching her face with trembling fingers. She was alive. Young. Unmarked by heartbreak. Outside, servants hurried through the gardens preparing for the celebration that would introduce her engagement to the prince later that afternoon. In her previous life, she had walked toward that ceremony believing it was the happiest day she would ever know. Now she saw it as the first step toward betrayal. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Her maid entered with a warm smile, carrying a beautifully folded ivory gown trimmed with delicate lace. "Everyone is waiting, Miss Harper. Today will change your life forever." Evelyn looked at the elegant dress for several long seconds before gently shaking her head. Her voice remained soft, but the certainty within it surprised even herself. "Please return it. I will not attend." The maid blinked in complete confusion, convinced she had misheard. The palace had spent months preparing for this announcement. Noble guests had traveled hundreds of miles to witness the future queen. Refusing was unthinkable. Yet Evelyn simply walked to the open window and looked beyond the palace walls toward the distant mountains hidden beneath silver clouds. Somewhere beyond those forests existed a future she had never dared imagine, one untouched by false promises and empty crowns. She did not know what waited for her there. She only knew that this time she would choose a different path, even if the entire kingdom believed she had lost her mind. The silence that followed Evelyn Harper's decision spread through the palace faster than any official announcement ever could. Servants stopped speaking whenever she entered a hallway. Noble guests exchanged bewildered glances behind polished fans. Even the musicians hired to celebrate the royal engagement hesitated, uncertain whether to continue rehearsing for a ceremony that no longer had a willing bride. Within a single hour, whispers had become rumors, and rumors had become certainty. The future queen had refused the crown. Evelyn welcomed every confused stare because she remembered something none of them could possibly understand. In another lifetime, every smiling face around her had watched her walk willingly toward a future built on empty promises. This time she intended to change every step before fate could catch her again. Her father found her standing alone in the palace gardens, where white roses climbed ancient stone walls beneath the bright spring sun. His expression carried equal measures of concern and disbelief. He gently asked whether fear had clouded her judgment or whether someone had threatened her. Evelyn looked into his familiar eyes and wished she could explain everything. She wished she could tell him that love without loyalty became a prison, that power without compassion consumed everyone who reached for it. Instead, she simply smiled with quiet sadness and answered, "I cannot marry a future that already destroyed me." Her father searched her face for meaning but found only calm determination. By sunset, the royal messenger arrived with an invitation that sounded more like a command. The prince wished to speak privately before the evening banquet. Evelyn did not hesitate. She folded the sealed letter and placed it into the fireplace without breaking the wax seal. The flames curled around the parchment until nothing remained except drifting gray ash. It felt strangely satisfying to watch the path that had once ruled her entire life disappear into smoke. Before dawn the following morning, she packed only a few practical belongings into a weathered leather satchel. She chose sturdy traveling clothes instead of elegant gowns and slipped quietly through the eastern gate while the palace still slept. The guards recognized her but assumed she had permission to leave. No one imagined the woman destined to become queen would simply walk away from everything. The farther she traveled, the lighter each breath became. Rolling green hills replaced marble towers. Wildflowers covered open meadows where no court politics could reach her. Small farming villages welcomed travelers without asking about noble titles, and children laughed freely beside clear streams that reflected the morning sky. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt as though the world belonged to ordinary people instead of ambitious rulers. Yet every peaceful mile reminded her that changing the future required more than escape. She remembered fragments from her previous life, scattered memories that had once seemed unimportant. Strange disappearances near the northern forest. Stories about a mysterious beast wandering beneath the ancient pines. Royal hunting parties returning empty-handed despite claiming victory. At the time, she had dismissed those stories as exaggerated legends told to entertain frightened villagers. Now every forgotten detail felt connected to a truth hidden beneath years of carefully crafted lies. As the sun dipped behind distant mountains, Evelyn reached the edge of the forbidden forest. Towering evergreens stretched toward the darkening sky, and a cool breeze carried the scent of rain and pine needles through the fading light. Travelers avoided this place after sunset, believing something cursed lived beyond the first line of trees. Evelyn stood quietly, listening to the wind moving through the branches, and an unfamiliar certainty settled deep within her heart. Whatever waited inside those woods frightened the entire kingdom. But unlike the smiling faces she had left behind, it had never betrayed her. The forest welcomed Evelyn Harper with a silence so complete that even her footsteps seemed reluctant to disturb it. Towering pine trees stretched high above her, their branches weaving together until only thin ribbons of afternoon sunlight reached the moss-covered ground. Every traveler she had met along the road had warned her to turn back before entering these woods. They spoke of an enormous wolf cursed by ancient magic, a creature blamed for every missing hunter, every abandoned campsite, and every unexplained shadow beneath the trees. In her previous life, Evelyn had believed those stories without question because they had come from respected nobles and trusted soldiers. Now she knew that fear often became the easiest disguise for hidden truths. She continued deeper into the forest until the familiar sounds of civilization disappeared completely. A narrow stream crossed her path, its crystal-clear water flowing gently over smooth stones. She knelt to fill her canteen, and that was when she noticed something unusual. Large paw prints marked the damp earth beside the stream. They were far bigger than those of any ordinary wolf, yet the spacing between them suggested slow, careful steps instead of the movements of a relentless predator. Curiosity quietly replaced caution. She followed the trail through thick ferns and ancient oak trees until the forest opened into a secluded clearing bathed in soft golden light. Wildflowers swayed peacefully in the breeze as though untouched by the fearful legends surrounding this place. At the far edge of the clearing rested an enormous white wolf unlike anything Evelyn had ever imagined. Its snow-colored fur shimmered beneath the fading sunlight, and its powerful frame carried an unmistakable sense of quiet dignity rather than menace. Brilliant amber eyes lifted toward her with a mixture of exhaustion, caution, and something that looked remarkably like loneliness. The wolf did not growl. It did not charge. It simply watched her, waiting to see whether she would become another person who judged before understanding. Evelyn remained perfectly still, allowing the silence to settle between them. Slowly she reached into her satchel and removed a small loaf of fresh bread along with a flask of clean water. She placed both on a flat stone several feet away before stepping back. "You do not have to trust me," she whispered gently. "I only want you to know that someone chose kindness today." The wolf studied her for several long moments before cautiously approaching the offering. Every movement reflected strength held carefully under control. As it lowered its head, Evelyn noticed faint silver markings woven through its fur like delicate strands of moonlight. They did not resemble scars. They resembled an ancient enchantment that pulsed softly with each steady breath. A cool wind drifted across the clearing, carrying distant echoes that sounded almost like hunting horns far beyond the trees. Instantly the wolf lifted its head, every muscle becoming alert as its calm expression hardened into quiet vigilance. Evelyn turned toward the sound and felt an uneasy chill settle over her. Whoever searched these woods was drawing closer. She looked back at the magnificent creature before her and realized something that changed everything she thought she knew. The kingdom had taught everyone to fear the wolf, yet in that peaceful clearing there was only one soul who seemed hunted. The distant sounds faded as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only the whisper of wind weaving through the ancient trees. Evelyn Harper remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the magnificent white wolf standing several feet away. Neither of them seemed eager to break the fragile understanding that had formed without a single promise being spoken. The wolf quietly finished the bread she had left upon the stone before lifting its gaze toward the deeper forest, as though listening to something she could not hear. Then, with calm confidence, it turned and walked away. Evelyn hesitated only for a moment before following at a respectful distance. She could not explain why every instinct urged her to trust the creature everyone else feared, but that same instinct had saved her from repeating the mistakes of her previous life. The narrow trail wound through towering pines until it reached a forgotten cabin hidden beneath climbing ivy and moss-covered branches. Time had weathered the small wooden home, yet someone had carefully maintained it. Fresh water rested inside a rain barrel. Firewood had been stacked neatly beneath the porch. Wild herbs grew in organized rows beside the entrance. Nothing about the place suggested the home of a mindless beast. It felt peaceful, almost lonely. The wolf paused beside the doorway before quietly disappearing into the cabin. Evelyn remained outside for several long moments, unsure whether she should leave or wait. Eventually curiosity overcame uncertainty. She stepped onto the porch and gently knocked against the weathered wooden frame. No answer came. Slowly she pushed the door open. Warm afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, revealing a modest room furnished with remarkable simplicity. A stone fireplace occupied one wall. Shelves held carefully preserved books, maps, and hand-carved wooden figures. A kettle rested above glowing embers, releasing the comforting aroma of mountain herbs. Then Evelyn noticed that the wolf had vanished. Standing near the opposite window instead was a tall man with snow-white hair falling loosely across his shoulders. He wore simple dark clothing that appeared worn by years of solitude rather than poverty. His striking amber eyes matched those of the wolf exactly. Surprise flashed across both of their faces before silence settled once more between them. The stranger regarded her with calm caution instead of alarm. "You should not be here," he said quietly. His voice carried quiet strength, softened by exhaustion rather than anger. Evelyn studied him carefully, recognizing the same loneliness she had seen moments earlier in the wolf's eyes. She did not ask impossible questions. Somehow she already knew the answer. "This is your home," she replied gently. "And you are the wolf." He neither confirmed nor denied her words. Instead, he looked toward the forest beyond the window, where fading sunlight painted long shadows across the clearing. "Most people run away when they see me," he admitted after a long silence. "You followed." Evelyn smiled with quiet understanding. "Most people only see what they are taught to fear." For the first time, the corners of the stranger's lips lifted into the faintest hint of a smile, almost as though he had forgotten how such an expression felt. Outside, evening settled peacefully over the forest while distant birds returned to their nests. Neither of them realized that far beyond the trees, royal riders had already begun searching every road leading north, convinced that the missing noblewoman could not have traveled far. Fate had quietly placed two forgotten souls beneath the same roof, and neither understood that the kingdom itself was already moving toward them. Morning arrived quietly beneath a blanket of silver mist that drifted through the towering pines surrounding the secluded cabin. Evelyn Harper woke to the comforting scent of fresh cedar and the soft crackle of a small fire that had already been carefully prepared before sunrise. She stepped outside and found the mysterious stranger standing beside the nearby stream, filling a wooden bucket with crystal-clear water while the first rays of sunlight reflected across the peaceful forest. He carried himself with effortless strength, yet there was an unmistakable sadness in every quiet movement, as though years of isolation had become as familiar as breathing. When he noticed her approaching, he offered a respectful nod instead of turning away. "You may stay until the roads are safe," he said calmly. "The forest is quieter than the kingdom." Evelyn smiled gently because she understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes silence protected people far better than crowded halls filled with polite conversations hiding selfish intentions. As the morning passed, they worked together without needing many words. Evelyn gathered wild berries and mountain herbs while the stranger repaired a section of the cabin roof that winter storms had weakened. The ordinary rhythm of shared work felt strangely comforting. There were no royal expectations, no carefully rehearsed smiles, and no hidden bargains disguised as kindness. For the first time since awakening in her second life, Evelyn felt that each passing hour truly belonged to her. Later that afternoon she prepared a simple meal using fresh vegetables growing beside the cabin, warm bread from her satchel, and fragrant herbs collected from the nearby hillside. When she placed the wooden bowl before him, the stranger paused with visible surprise. "No one has cooked for me in many years," he admitted quietly. Evelyn answered with an easy smile. Then today seemed like the right day to begin again. They shared the modest meal while sunlight poured through the cabin windows, filling the room with a warm golden glow. Conversation came slowly at first, but little by little they spoke about ordinary things instead of painful memories. He explained how the changing seasons transformed the forest, where the clearest springs could be found, and which wildflowers always bloomed after the first summer rain. Evelyn found herself laughing more than she had in years. The sound surprised even her because she had almost forgotten what genuine happiness felt like. As evening settled across the mountains, the stranger stepped outside and gazed toward the darkening horizon with quiet concern. Faint echoes of distant horns drifted through the trees once again, followed by the distant rhythm of horses traveling along old forest roads. Evelyn joined him on the porch, noticing the change in his expression. "They are searching again," he said softly. "They come farther every season." Evelyn looked toward the fading light beyond the forest and suddenly remembered another forgotten piece of her previous life. The royal court had once celebrated the disappearance of a powerful alpha ruler who had vanished without explanation years before her engagement. The stories had insisted that he abandoned his people. Standing beside the quiet stranger, those official tales no longer sounded believable. She turned toward him with thoughtful eyes. "You know more about the kingdom than someone living alone should know." For a brief moment, silence returned between them. Then he looked directly into her eyes and answered with calm honesty. "Because I once belonged to it, before it decided I no longer should." The words lingered in the quiet cabin long after they had been spoken. Evelyn Harper looked at the mysterious man with renewed curiosity, sensing that every answer only revealed another hidden layer beneath the peaceful life he had built inside the forest. She did not press him for more. In her previous life she had learned that trust could never be demanded. It had to be offered freely, one honest moment at a time. As evening settled over the mountains, they sat beside the fireplace while gentle rain tapped against the cabin roof. The stranger carefully added another piece of firewood before speaking again. "My name is Damien Blackwood." Evelyn repeated his name softly, allowing it to settle into her memory. There was something strangely familiar about it, as though she had heard it years ago beneath layers of forgotten conversations inside the royal palace. Then a distant memory returned. She remembered elderly nobles whispering about an alpha king who had disappeared before she ever arrived at court. Official records insisted that he had abandoned his throne, but the older servants always lowered their voices whenever they mentioned his name, as though the truth belonged to someone else. Evelyn looked into Damien's amber eyes and quietly asked, "Did you once wear a crown?" He remained silent for several heartbeats before giving the smallest nod. long ago. His answer carried no pride, only quiet acceptance. He explained that the forest had become both his refuge and his prison after an ancient curse changed his life forever. During every full moon his spirit transformed into the great white wolf the kingdom feared. Over time the stories grew larger than the truth. Parents frightened their children with tales of a monster lurking beneath the trees. Hunters searched for glory instead of understanding. The kingdom slowly forgot the man and remembered only the legend. Evelyn listened without interruption. Unlike the palace, where every conversation hid another ambition, Damien spoke with remarkable honesty. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not defend himself. He simply accepted the burden that had shaped his life. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving thousands of tiny drops sparkling across the forest beneath a sky filled with bright stars. Evelyn stepped onto the porch and breathed deeply. The cool night air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, filling her with an unexpected feeling of peace. Damien quietly joined her, standing several feet away as they admired the endless sky together. Neither of them noticed how naturally silence had become comfortable between them. At dawn the next morning that fragile peace was interrupted by the distant sound of horses moving along the old northern road. Damien immediately recognized the rhythm of trained royal mounts. His expression grew serious, though not fearful. Evelyn climbed the small hill overlooking the trees and saw flashes of polished armor reflecting the rising sun far beyond the forest. Royal banners moved steadily through the morning mist. They were no longer searching blindly. Someone had discovered where she had gone. As the riders continued drawing closer, Damien turned toward the cabin with quiet resolve while Evelyn realized that fate had found her once again. The difference was that this time she was no longer standing alone before a kingdom that had already decided her future. The forest awakened before the royal riders reached its heart, as though the ancient trees themselves sensed that old promises were about to be tested. Evelyn Harper watched from the cabin porch while faint flashes of polished armor disappeared and reappeared between the distant pines. The riders advanced carefully, stopping often to study broken branches and fresh footprints. They were not wandering anymore. Someone had given them a destination. Damien Blackwood quietly secured the cabin door before gathering only a small travel bag containing dried herbs, clean bandages, and several weathered books that seemed too valuable to abandon. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not speak with anger. Years of solitude had taught him that surviving often depended more upon wisdom than strength. Evelyn noticed the calm certainty in every movement and understood that he had prepared for this possibility long before she ever entered the forest. "There is another place," he said softly. "Very few people know the path." She nodded without hesitation. There was no longer a reason to return to the palace that had already written her future once before. Together they followed a narrow trail hidden beneath thick ferns and towering evergreens, moving deeper into the untouched wilderness where sunlight filtered through layers of emerald leaves. Along the way Damien showed her hidden springs, ancient stone markers almost completely reclaimed by moss, and enormous trees that had stood silently for centuries. Every step revealed that he knew the forest as intimately as most people knew their own homes. As the morning passed, Evelyn began noticing something else. Birds landed fearlessly on nearby branches whenever Damien stopped to rest. Deer quietly emerged from the trees instead of fleeing. Even frightened woodland creatures seemed strangely comforted by his presence. The forest did not fear the cursed wolf. It welcomed its forgotten king. Near midday they reached the ruins of an ancient sanctuary where smooth white stone columns rose from a meadow filled with blooming wildflowers. Vines wrapped gently around weathered carvings depicting wolves standing beside human guardians beneath a full moon. At the center rested a crystal spring so clear that every cloud drifting overhead reflected upon its surface. Damien remained silent for several moments before speaking. Long before kingdoms were built, this was where alpha rulers pledged to protect every life under their care. Evelyn slowly walked around the forgotten sanctuary, running her fingertips across the faded carvings. One image caught her attention immediately. It showed an alpha king beside a woman offering both hands toward a circle of silver light while broken chains dissolved into the air. "This symbol," she whispered. "I have seen it before." Memories from her previous life returned in scattered fragments. Hidden among dusty palace records had been an old page bearing the same design, dismissed by royal scholars as meaningless folklore. Damien stepped beside her and studied the ancient carving with quiet hope. The elders believed that no curse created through fear could survive where trust was freely given. Neither of them claimed to understand exactly what those words meant, yet something changed the moment Evelyn placed her hand gently upon the weathered stone. The silver markings she had once seen beneath Damien's white fur shimmered faintly beneath his skin before slowly growing softer, as though the ancient sanctuary itself had recognized him. Damien looked down at his hands in silent disbelief. For the first time in countless years, the burden he carried seemed just a little lighter, and both of them realized that the path ahead was no longer about escaping the kingdom. It was about uncovering a forgotten truth powerful enough to restore what fear had stolen from them both. The forgotten sanctuary remained wrapped in peaceful silence as the gentle silver light surrounding the ancient carvings slowly faded into the morning air. Damien Blackwood stood motionless beside the crystal spring, quietly studying his own hands as the faint silver markings beneath his skin continued to soften. For the first time in years, the curse no longer felt like an unbreakable chain. It felt like something that had finally begun to loosen. Evelyn Harper watched the change with quiet relief, but she also understood that hope often attracted new challenges before it revealed lasting peace. As they prepared to leave the sanctuary, a familiar voice echoed across the meadow. It was not filled with anger. It carried the polished confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders. Emerging from the edge of the forest came a small group of royal envoys carrying white banners instead of drawn weapons. At their head stood an elderly council member Evelyn recognized immediately from the palace. Time had added more gray to his hair, but his careful smile remained exactly the same. He bowed respectfully before speaking. "Lady Evelyn, the kingdom wishes to welcome you home. His Highness regrets the misunderstanding and asks that you return. The throne still awaits you." Evelyn listened without interrupting. In another lifetime those words would have filled her heart with hope. Now they sounded hollow, like an echo from a dream she had already survived. The council member then turned toward Damien. His expression became more cautious. "And if the former Alpha King returns peacefully, the court is prepared to discuss his future as well." Damien remained silent. He had spent enough years away from the palace to recognize promises that depended entirely upon obedience. Evelyn stepped forward before he could answer. She looked toward the distant mountains, then back at the envoys waiting patiently for her decision. "Tell the court that I am grateful for the invitation," she said calmly. "But I will not exchange peace for another throne." The old council member blinked with visible surprise. "You would refuse a crown?" Evelyn smiled softly. "A crown without trust is only another kind of prison." Silence settled across the meadow. Even the wind seemed to pause among the ancient columns. Damien looked at her with quiet admiration, realizing that she had not only escaped her former life but had also released herself from the power it once held over her heart. The council member slowly lowered his head in respectful acknowledgement. Without another argument, he signaled for the envoys to depart. Their horses disappeared between the trees until only the sound of birds remained. Damien released a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "You walked away from everything they offered," he said quietly. Evelyn turned toward the crystal spring, where their reflections shimmered side by side upon the clear water. "No," she answered gently. "I walked toward the life I finally chose." At that very moment the surface of the spring began to glow once more, and the ancient wolf carvings surrounding the sanctuary reflected brilliant silver light across the meadow. The last traces of the curse faded from Damien's hands like morning mist beneath the rising sun. He felt no sudden surge of power, only a deep and unfamiliar sense of freedom. Standing together beneath the ancient trees, neither of them desired a throne anymore. They had discovered something far greater than a kingdom could ever promise, and the forest itself seemed to welcome the beginning of the future they had chosen together. Several months passed, and the forest slowly became more than a refuge. It became home. Each sunrise painted the mountains with soft shades of gold while gentle streams carried fresh water through fields of wildflowers that seemed brighter with every changing season. Evelyn Harper no longer measured her days by royal ceremonies or whispered expectations. Instead, she counted the arrival of migrating birds, the blooming of spring flowers, and the peaceful evenings spent beside the cabin she and Damien Blackwood had restored together. The old wooden walls now echoed with quiet laughter instead of lonely silence. Shelves once filled only with forgotten books also held baskets of herbs, fresh bread, and carved keepsakes collected during long walks beneath the towering pines. The forest that had once been feared by the kingdom gradually welcomed travelers seeking peace rather than glory. Families occasionally stopped beside the nearby stream, discovering that the mysterious stories they had heard since childhood did not match the kindness they found waiting among the trees. Evelyn greeted every visitor with warmth, offering clean water, fresh food, and directions through the safest mountain paths. Damien quietly repaired broken bridges after heavy storms, planted young trees where old ones had fallen, and guided lost travelers back toward familiar roads without ever asking for recognition. Little by little, the frightening legends surrounding the White Wolf faded into something entirely different. Children began telling new stories about a guardian who watched over the northern forest with gentle strength instead of fear. Word of those stories eventually reached the kingdom. Even within the palace, people slowly stopped speaking of monsters and started wondering whether the old legends had hidden the truth all along. The royal court sent no more invitations. No more promises arrived sealed with polished wax. Time quietly carried those ambitions away, replacing them with something far more valuable than power. One cool autumn evening, Evelyn and Damien returned to the ancient sanctuary where their lives had changed forever. The crystal spring remained as clear as ever, reflecting thousands of bright stars across its perfectly still surface. The weathered carvings of wolves and guardians seemed almost alive beneath the silver moonlight. Damien looked at his reflection and realized that the faint silver markings of the curse had disappeared completely. Nothing remained except the quiet confidence of the man he had once believed was lost forever. He turned toward Evelyn with grateful eyes. "You gave me back more than freedom," he said softly. "You reminded me who I was before fear defined my life." Evelyn gently shook her head. "You did the same for me. I came here believing I had escaped my past. Instead, I found my future." They stood together in comfortable silence as a cool breeze carried the scent of pine across the ancient stones. Neither of them wore a crown. Neither of them ruled from a palace. Yet the peace surrounding them felt richer than any throne either of them had ever known. As dawn slowly approached, the first rays of sunlight reached the sanctuary, filling the meadow with warm golden light. Birds greeted the new morning from the highest branches while the forest awakened around them with quiet joy. Evelyn smiled as Damien reached for her hand, and together they began the familiar walk home beneath the towering trees. The kingdom would remember them in many different ways, but the forest would remember the truth. Real strength had never come from power, and destiny had never belonged to a throne. It had always belonged to two hearts that chose kindness when fear demanded something else.